Doctor orders ultrasound. After girl acts strangely around dad, what he sees next sends him into a panic. The chilling mystery unfolds when a quiet teenager shows up at a small-town clinic, her overbearing father by her side. Something about her behavior, her nervous fidgeting, her refusal to make eye contact, sets off alarm bells for the compassionate doctor on duty. A routine checkup takes a shocking turn after an ultrasound reveals a devastating secret, one that leaves the doctor reeling. With time running out, the doctor must race against the clock to uncover the truth and protect her vulnerable patient. What happens next will leave you breathless. The Pinecrest Clinic buzzed with its usual quiet energy, but Dr. Eric Miles felt uneasy as Javier Ortega and his daughter Sophia entered the exam room. Javier was all charm, his smile polished yet hollow, while Sophia, frail and withdrawn, avoided eye contact entirely. "Doctor, my daughter's been having stomach pain," Javier explained briskly, dismissing Sophia's soft protest with a firm hand on her shoulder. Dr. Miles nodded, turning to Sophia. "Can you show me where it hurts?" She hesitated, pointing vaguely to her lower abdomen before retreating into silence. After a brief examination, Dr. Miles grew suspicious. Sophia's demeanor, her trembling hands, downcast eyes, and flinches at her father's touch, spoke volumes. When he pressed further, she whispered faintly about discomfort, but offered little else. In the privacy of the exam room, Dr. Miles used an ultrasound machine. The screen revealed the shocking truth. Sophia was 28 weeks pregnant. Her breath hitched, tears streaming silently as she stared at the image in horror. Dr. Miles turned off the machine, his voice calm but resolute. "Sophia, are you safe at home?" She didn't answer, glancing fearfully toward the door where Javier waited. The weight of the situation settled heavily over Dr. Miles. Whatever was happening in Sophia's life, it was far darker than it appeared, and unraveling the truth would require careful precision. Dr. Miles returned to the exam room, his expression carefully neutral as he faced Javier and Sophia. The weight of what he'd discovered pressed heavily on him, but he knew better than to confront Javier outright. Not yet. Instead, he focused on buying time. "Sophia's condition requires further testing," Dr. Miles said evenly, avoiding direct eye contact with Javier. "I'd like to schedule a follow-up appointment for later this week." Javier's smile tightened, his charm faltering slightly. "Testing? For stomach pain? Isn't that a bit excessive?" "It's standard procedure when symptoms are unclear," Dr. Miles replied smoothly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Better safe than sorry." Sophia sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her hoodie sleeves had ridden up slightly, revealing faint bruises along her forearms, marks that looked more like fingerprints than accidental scrapes. Dr. Miles's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he forced himself to remain calm. When Javier excused himself briefly to take a phone call outside, Dr. Miles seized the opportunity. Leaning closer to Sophia, he spoke softly, urgently. "Sophia, I need you to tell me the truth. Did someone hurt you?" Her wide, frightened eyes darted toward the door before returning to her lap. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, but her trembling lips betrayed her fear. "No one hurts me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't conviction, it was rehearsed. Dr. Miles recognized the signs immediately. The flat tone, the avoidance of eye contact, the way she seemed to shrink into herself under even the gentlest scrutiny. Before he could press further, Javier re-entered the room, his presence suffocating the fragile moment. Sophia visibly recoiled, retreating deeper into silence. Later that evening, Dr. Miles sat alone in his office, staring at Sophia's file. The ultrasound image mocked him from the corner of his desk, a reminder of how young she was and how dire her situation likely was. He couldn't shake the image of those bruises or the haunted look in her eyes. He picked up the phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. "Detective Harris, it's Eric Miles. I need your advice on something sensitive." As he recounted the details, Dr. Miles felt a knot tighten in his chest. Sophia's silent cries were louder than words, and they demanded justice. But unraveling the truth would mean navigating treacherous waters, especially with someone as calculating as Javier Ortega watching every move. Dr. Miles leaned against the exam table, his arms crossed as he tried to maintain control of the situation. Javier, however, seemed determined to take charge. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he laughed lightly, brushing off any concern. "Oh, doctor, Sophia's always been a bit dramatic," Javier said with an indulgent chuckle, glancing at his daughter as if she were a child exaggerating a scraped knee. "She probably just ate something that didn't agree with her. You know how teenagers are. Everything's a crisis." Sophia flinched at his words but said nothing, her gaze fixed on the floor. The bruises on her arms peeked out again as she tugged nervously at her sleeves, and Dr. Miles noticed her fingers trembling. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stay calm despite the rising tension in the room. "I understand your concern, Mr. Ortega," Dr. Miles replied evenly, his tone measured. "But given Sophia's age and symptoms, it's important we rule out anything serious. Better safe than sorry, right?" Javier's smile faltered for a split second, replaced by a flicker of irritation before he masked it with another laugh. Of course. I'm not questioning your expertise, doctor. It's just, well, Sophia tends to get anxious over small things. She's sensitive, you know? Always has been." "Sensitive or not," Dr. Miles countered gently but firmly, "her health is my priority, and based on what I've seen today, additional tests are necessary." Javier's charm began to crack further, his voice sharpening slightly. "Tests cost money, doctor. Surely there's no need to jump to extremes here. Can't you just give her something for the pain and send us on our way?" Dr. Miles met Javier's gaze directly, his own expression unyielding. "Mr. Ortega, I'm sure you'd agree that Sophia's well-being is worth taking seriously. These precautions aren't about expense. They're about ensuring she gets the care she needs." For a brief moment, Javier's mask slipped entirely. His eyes narrowed, and a cold edge crept into his voice. "Fine, if you insist, but let's not drag this out unnecessarily, all right?" As Javier turned to check his phone yet again, Sophia finally raised her head, meeting Dr. Miles's eyes for the first time. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tightly together, but there was something else, a fleeting spark of hope, quickly extinguished when Javier glanced back at her. Later, as the clinic emptied and the evening light faded, Dr. Miles sat alone in his office, replaying the scene in his mind. Javier's attempts to dominate the conversation, downplay Sophia's condition, and rush them out of the clinic only deepened his suspicions. The bruises on Sophia's arms, her haunted silence, and the fear radiating from her like heat, it all pointed to one chilling conclusion. Whatever was happening in the Ortega household, it wasn't benign, and Javier's polished exterior hid something far darker beneath. Dr. Miles picked up the phone once more, dialing Detective Harris. As the line rang, he whispered under his breath, "Not on my watch, Javier. Not on my watch." As Javier continued to dominate the conversation, his polished charm masking an undercurrent of impatience, Dr. Miles kept one eye on Sophia. Her small frame seemed to shrink further into the chair. Her hands clasped so tightly they turned white. But then, as Javier turned away briefly to glance at his phone again, Sophia made her move. With a furtive glance toward her father, she slipped something, a tiny scrap of paper, into the box of examination gloves on the counter. The motion was so quick and subtle that even Dr. Miles almost missed it. By the time Javier refocused his attention on the room, Sophia had already retreated back into herself, her face blank but her eyes pleading. Moments later, as Javier wrapped up their visit with another overly cheerful dismissal, Dr. Miles walked them to the door. "I'll see you both soon for follow-up tests," he said evenly, his tone leaving no room for argument. Once they were gone, he closed the door firmly behind them and returned to the exam room. His heart raced as he opened the box of gloves and found the crumpled note tucked inside. Unfolding it carefully, he read the shaky handwriting scrawled across the torn piece of notebook paper. "Help me, he lies." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. There was no signature, no elaboration. Just those four desperate, haunting words. Dr. Miles stared at the note, his mind racing. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to confirm his worst fears. Enough to know that Sophia was trapped in something far more dangerous than even he had suspected. He glanced at the clock. There was still time to act. Pulling out his phone once more, he dialed Detective Harris's number. This time, his voice carried a new urgency. "Detective, we need to talk. Now." By the time evening settled over Pinecrest, Dr. Miles sat alone in his office, the note resting on his desk like a silent accusation. Every instinct told him to intervene immediately, to shield Sophia from whatever nightmare awaited her at home. But he knew better. One wrong move could put her in even greater danger. For now, all he could do was wait, plan, and prepare. Because one thing was certain. Javier Ortega wasn't just lying, he was hiding something monstrous. And Sophia's whispered cry for help had lit a fire in Dr. Miles that wouldn't be extinguished until justice was served. The evening air was cool as Dr. Miles pulled into his driveway, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. He'd spent hours poring over Sophia's file, replaying every detail of her visit in his mind. The crumpled note, "Help me, he lies," burned like a brand in his thoughts. Something had to be done, but he needed more. Something concrete to take to the authorities. As he stepped out of his car, the glow of the porch light caught something unusual in his mailbox. Frowning, he walked over and opened it to find a plain white envelope resting inside. There was no name, no stamp, just his address scrawled hastily across the front in block letters. His pulse quickened as he carried the envelope inside, locking the door behind him before sitting at his kitchen table. With trembling hands, he slid a letter opener beneath the flap and carefully unfolded its contents. Inside were several grainy black and white photographs. At first glance, they seemed almost innocuous, blurry snapshots taken from a distance. But as Dr. Miles examined them more closely, his blood ran cold. Each image featured Sophia, her thin frame unmistakable despite the poor quality of the photos. In one, she stood outside their modest home, clutching a grocery bag, her face etched with fear as she glanced over her shoulder. In another, she sat hunched on the edge of a couch, her arms wrapped around herself protectively, fresh bruises visible even in the dim lighting. But it was the final photo that stopped his breath entirely. Javier looming over her, his hand raised mid-swing, his expression twisted with fury. Dr. Miles felt sick to his stomach. Whoever had sent these images knew far more than they were letting on, and they wanted him to see the truth. The implication was clear. Javier wasn't just controlling or dismissive. He was violent, dangerous. But who could have sent them? And why now? He spread the photos across the table, studying each one for clues. There was no note, no explanation, just the damning evidence staring back at him. Whoever had taken these pictures had risked everything to expose what was happening behind closed doors. It was both a gift and a burden, giving him leverage but also raising countless questions. Picking up his phone, Dr. Miles hesitated. He couldn't ignore this. Not anymore. Detective Harris needed to see this immediately. But as he dialed the number, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that someone out there knew exactly how deep this rabbit hole went and whether he'd be willing to follow it all the way down. By the time he hung up with Detective Harris, Dr. Miles realized the stakes had changed. These photos weren't just proof. They were a lifeline for Sophia, a chance to pull her out of the shadows where she'd been suffering in silence. But they also made him a target. Whoever had delivered the envelope had entrusted him with dangerous knowledge. And if Javier ever found out, Dr. Miles stared at the photos once more, his jaw tightening. For Sophia's sake, he couldn't afford to look away now. Not when the whispers of Pinecrest were finally beginning to speak loud and clear. Dr. Miles sat in the dim light of his kitchen, the photographs spread out before him like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. His mind raced, torn between the ethical boundaries of his profession and the horrifying reality unfolding before him. As a physician, he was bound by confidentiality, the sacred trust between doctor and patient. But this went far beyond a routine case. Sophia wasn't just another name on a chart. She was a terrified child trapped in a nightmare, her cries for help muffled but unmistakable. And now these photos painted a picture so grim it left no room for denial. His hands trembled as he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. What's the right thing to do, he asked himself over and over again. Reporting Javier based on anonymous evidence risked escalating the danger for Sofia. If Javier found out, the consequences could be catastrophic. Yet staying silent felt like complicity, an abandonment of the oath he'd sworn to protect life above all else. The professional side of him argued for caution. He needed more, harder proof, legal grounds to act without putting Sofia directly in harm's way. But the human side of him screamed louder. How could he sit idly by while a young girl lived in fear, her body bearing the scars of abuse? Every instinct told him to storm into Detective Harris's office, first thing in the morning, photos in hand, and demand action. But at what cost? He thought about Sofia's face during their visit, the way she flinched at her father's touch, the haunted look in her eyes when she slipped him that note. She had trusted him, even if only in the smallest way. That tiny act of courage weighed heavily on him now. If he failed her, if he chose silence over intervention, he would never forgive himself. And then there was Javier. Charming, polished, calculating Javier. Dr. Miles knew men like him, wolves in sheep's clothing who thrived on control and manipulation. Confronting someone like that required precision, timing, and ironclad evidence, or else the predator would twist the narrative to suit his own ends. Javier wouldn't hesitate to discredit Sofia, or worse, retaliate against her. For hours, Dr. Miles wrestled with the dilemma, pacing the length of his kitchen until his feet ached. Finally, exhaustion forced him to sit down again. He stared at the photos one last time before carefully gathering them up and sliding them back into the envelope. Whatever decision he made, it couldn't wait. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and possibly new opportunities to protect Sofia. But tonight, as he turned off the kitchen light and climbed the stairs to bed, sleep eluded him. The faces in the photos lingered in his mind, haunting him. Sofia's frightened expression, Javier's raised hand frozen in time, and somewhere in the shadows, the unknown person who had taken these images, who had placed their faith in him to do the right thing. By dawn, Dr. Miles had resolved one thing. He wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. Whether through official channels or otherwise, he would find a way to shield Sofia from the monster hiding behind her father's smile. Because sometimes, doing the right thing meant stepping outside the lines, even if it came at a price. The next morning, Dr. Miles arrived at the clinic earlier than usual, his mind still churning with unanswered questions. He couldn't shake the feeling that Javier's control over Sofia wasn't an isolated incident, that there was a deeper history lurking beneath the surface. Determined to uncover the truth, he decided to dig into the Ortegas' past. At the local courthouse, Dr. Miles sifted through dusty records and old case files under the guise of medical research. It didn't take long for him to find what he was looking for, a restraining order filed years ago by Elena Ortega against her husband, Javier. The document detailed allegations of physical abuse, emotional manipulation, and threats, claims eerily similar to what Dr. Miles now suspected was happening to Sofia. But something about the file felt off. Despite the severity of the charges, the case had been abruptly dismissed without explanation. A handwritten note in the margins read, "Petitioner withdrew complaint, no further action taken." There was no follow-up, no investigation, nothing to suggest why Elena would suddenly drop such serious accusations. Dr. Miles frowned, his unease growing. He remembered Elena vaguely, a quiet woman who rarely came into the clinic, but always seemed anxious when she did. She'd stopped coming altogether after Sofia was born, retreating further into the shadows of their small town. Rumors whispered that she'd moved away, but no one seemed to know for sure. As he pored over the documents, one detail stood out: the name of the judge who oversaw the dismissal, Judge Harold Grayson, a well-connected figure known for his leniency in domestic cases involving prominent families. Grayson had since retired, but his reputation lingered, along with whispers of favoritism and backroom deals. Dr. Miles copied the relevant pages, his hands trembling slightly as he pieced together the implications. If Javier had manipulated the system once before, silencing Elena and burying the truth, how far would he go to protect himself now? And where was Elena today? Was she still alive? Or had she become another victim of Javier's wrath? Back at the clinic, Dr. Miles stared at the copied documents spread across his desk. The restraining order was more than just evidence of Javier's violent tendencies. It was a warning. This man knew how to erase inconvenient truths, how to bend people and systems to his will. Protecting Sofia wouldn't be as simple as filing a report or calling child services. Not if Javier could twist the narrative to make her look unstable or untrustworthy. Yet amidst the frustration and fear, a spark of hope flickered within Dr. Miles. For the first time, he had tangible proof that Javier wasn't above scrutiny. Combined with the anonymous photos and Sofia's desperate plea for help, this fragment of the past might be enough to build a stronger case, if handled carefully. He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Harris again. "I found something you need to see," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This goes deeper than we thought." By evening, Dr. Miles sat alone in his office once more, staring at the clock as daylight faded. The echoes of Elena's failed attempt at justice weighed heavily on him, mingling with the knowledge that Sofia's fate now rested partly in his hands. Somewhere out there, someone else had tried and failed to stop Javier. He couldn't let history repeat itself. For Sofia's sake, he vowed to fight harder, smarter, and quieter than anyone expected, because sometimes justice required patience, and sometimes it demanded sacrifice. Dr. Miles stared at the name on the court document again, Elena Ortega. His mind raced as he pieced together the implications of what he'd uncovered. Javier hadn't just silenced Elena by pressuring her to drop the original restraining order. He'd flipped the narrative entirely. Somewhere along the way, he turned the tables, painting her as unstable and using the legal system to keep her away from Sofia. The realization hit Dr. Miles like a gut punch. Elena wasn't absent because she didn't care. She was estranged because Javier had made sure of it. By petitioning for his own restraining orders against her, he'd effectively severed any chance of mother and daughter reuniting. And if the rumors were true, that Elena had moved away or disappeared altogether, then she might still be living in fear, trapped in the shadow of the man who'd once vowed to love and protect her. Determined to find answers, Dr. Miles spent the next day tracking down leads. He started with old acquaintances of Elena's, people who might have known her before she faded into obscurity. One name kept coming up, Maria Alvarez, an elderly woman who had been close to Elena during her marriage to Javier. Maria lived on the outskirts of Pinecrest in a modest house surrounded by overgrown gardens. When Dr. Miles arrived, she greeted him warily, her sharp eyes assessing him through the screen door. After explaining his intentions carefully, omitting sensitive details for Elena's safety, Maria finally invited him inside. "She was a good woman," Maria said softly, shaking her head as she settled into a creaky armchair. "Too gentle for someone like Javier. He broke her spirit long before he broke her body." Dr. Miles leaned forward, his voice low. "Do you know where she is now?" Maria hesitated, glancing toward the window as if expecting someone to appear. After everything that happened, the abuse, the court case, the lies, they forced her out. She left town, changed her name, said she couldn't risk being near Sofia, not with Javier watching every move she made. "Why didn't she fight harder?" Dr. Miles asked, frustration creeping into his tone. "Surely there was something—" "You don't understand," Maria interrupted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Javier made sure no one believed her. He twisted things, spread stories about how unstable she was. Even her own family turned their backs on her. She had nothing left but shame and fear." Dr. Miles clenched his fists, the injustice of it all burning in his chest. But Maria wasn't finished. "She called me once, years ago," Maria continued, pulling a worn notebook from a drawer. "Said she wanted to see Sofia again, even if it was just from afar. Gave me this address." She handed the scrap of paper to Dr. Miles, her hands shaking slightly. "I don't know if it's still valid, but maybe she can help you. Maybe she can help Sofia." That night, Dr. Miles sat alone in his office. staring at the faded address scrawled on the paper. Elena Morales, 412 Maple Street, Cedar Ridge. A new identity, a new life. But likely the same scars, the same fears. Reaching out to Elena would be risky. Contacting her could put both her and Sophia in greater danger. Yet as he thought about Sophia's haunted eyes and Elena's desperate attempts to survive, he knew he couldn't ignore the possibility. For the first time, Dr. Miles allowed himself to hope, not blindly but cautiously. If Elena was willing to face her past, to confront the monster she'd fled, then perhaps they stood a chance. Together they might uncover the truth and give Sophia the justice she deserved. But one thing was certain. Whatever path lay ahead, it wouldn't be easy. Javier Ortega had spent years weaving his web of control and deceit. Untangling it would require courage, strategy, and trust in those brave enough to stand against him. Dr. Miles stared at the address for Elena Morales, his mind racing with questions. What had really happened to drive her out of Pinecrest? And why had the town so readily sided with Javier, a man whose charm masked something far darker? To understand Sophia's present, he needed to unravel the past. A reputation's destroyed. Maria Alvarez's words echoed in his mind. Javier twisted things, spread stories about how unstable she was. Dr. Miles realized that Javier hadn't just relied on legal maneuvering. He'd systematically dismantled Elena's credibility. In small towns like Pinecrest, reputation meant everything. A whisper campaign could destroy someone faster than any court ruling. Elena had been vulnerable from the start, a soft-spoken woman without family connections or financial independence. When she first filed the restraining order, some in the community likely sympathized with her plight. But Javier, ever the calculated manipulator, struck back hard. He hired a slick attorney who painted Elena as emotionally erratic, pointing to moments of stress or exhaustion as proof of instability. Neighbors began repeating these narratives, how she sometimes seemed nervous or withdrawn, how she rarely attended social gatherings. Slowly but surely, doubt crept in. Even worse, Javier leveraged his position as a respected businessman and community figure. His outward charm made it easy for people to believe him over Elena. After all, who would suspect the charming Javier Ortega of being capable of such cruelty? The town's complicity, Pinecrest itself, played a role in Elena's downfall. It wasn't malice necessarily, but apathy and fear. People didn't want to confront the ugly truth about one of their own. Acknowledging Javier's violence would force them to face uncomfortable realities about themselves and their community. So they chose the easier path: disbelief. Local authorities weren't immune to this bias either. Judge Harold Grayson's dismissal of Elena's case wasn't an anomaly. It was part of a pattern. Domestic violence cases often went unpunished in Pinecrest, especially when the accused held influence. Javier knew exactly how to exploit this system, using his wealth and charisma to sway opinions and silence dissent. When Elena withdrew her complaint under mounting pressure, many saw it as confirmation of her supposed instability. Few questioned why she might have felt she had no other choice. By the time Javier petitioned for his own restraining order against her, portraying her as a threat to Sophia, public opinion had already turned firmly against her. Fear kept her silent. As Dr. Miles pieced together Elena's story, he understood why she fled. Staying in Pinecrest would have meant living under Javier's shadow forever, unable to protect herself or her daughter. Every attempt to speak out had been met with ridicule, hostility, or indifference. Even those who might have believed her were too afraid to act, knowing Javier's reach extended far beyond his immediate circle. Leaving was her only option, but it came at a cost. She sacrificed her relationship with Sophia, forced to watch from afar as Javier tightened his grip on their daughter. For years she lived in exile, carrying the weight of guilt and grief while hoping against hope that Sophia would somehow escape her father's control. A fragile thread of hope. Now armed with Maria's address and a deeper understanding of Elena's ordeal, Dr. Miles felt both anger and resolve. Anger at the injustice Elena had endured, and resolve to ensure her suffering wouldn't be in vain. If Elena was willing to come forward, her testimony could be the key to exposing Javier's lies and freeing Sophia. But contacting her wouldn't be simple. Years of hiding had undoubtedly left scars. Trusting anyone, even someone like Dr. Miles who wanted to help, would take courage she might not feel ready to summon. Still, he owed it to Sophia to try. That night, as he locked up the clinic and drove home, Dr. Miles replayed the pieces of the puzzle in his mind. Elena's forced exile, the town's complicity, Javier's masterful manipulation. It all pointed to one chilling conclusion. Justice in Pinecrest wasn't blind. It was bought. And if Sophia were to have any chance at freedom, they'd need more than evidence. They'd need allies brave enough to stand up to Javier, no matter the cost. The phone call to Child Protective Services was brief but urgent. Dr. Miles knew he couldn't delay any longer. Sophia's life depended on swift action. As he hung up, his heart pounded with a mix of hope and dread. Hope that this would finally set Sophia free. Dread that Javier might sense the net closing in. A father's desperation. Javier Ortega wasn't a man accustomed to losing control. But as days passed and whispers of suspicion began swirling around him, his polished facade started to crack. He noticed the subtle changes, the way neighbors avoided meeting his eyes, the increased scrutiny during routine errands at the grocery store, even the lingering looks from certain staff members at the clinic. Something was off. Then came the final straw. A suspicious black sedan parked down the street from their house one evening. Javier didn't recognize it, but its presence gnawed at him. Someone was watching. Someone knew. That night, under the cover of darkness, Javier packed hastily. Clothes, cash, fake IDs. He'd prepared for this moment years ago, always planning for the worst-case scenario. He shook Sophia awake roughly, his charm replaced by cold desperation. "Get up," he hissed, grabbing her arm. "We're leaving, now." Sophia stumbled out of bed, her wide eyes filled with terror. She tried to resist, but Javier's grip was like iron. "Dad, please," she whimpered, tears streaming down her face. "No time for questions," he snapped, dragging her toward the car. "Do exactly what I say if you want to live." As they reached the driveway, headlights suddenly pierced the darkness. A patrol car screeched to a halt behind them, blocking their escape. Deputy Marla Green stepped out, her hand resting on her holstered gun. "Stay right there, Javier," she called firmly, her voice cutting through the tense night air. Marla's redemption. Deputy Marla Green had spent decades wearing the badge in Pinecrest, but not all her memories were ones of pride. One case haunted her above all others. Elena Ortega's failed attempt to seek justice. Back then, Marla had been too green, too eager to trust the system, and too blind to see through Javier's lies. When the restraining order was dismissed, she told herself it wasn't her fault, that she'd done everything by the book. But deep down, she knew better. She'd let fear and complacency cloud her judgment, and now, years later, she carried the weight of that mistake. When Dr. Miles approached her with the evidence he'd gathered, the photos, the court records, the anonymous tip, she saw her chance to make things right. "This ends tonight," she vowed, gripping the steering wheel as she sped toward the Ortega residence. Her radio crackled with updates from dispatch, confirming Javier's suspected escape attempt. This was her moment to redeem herself, to protect the daughter Elena had been forced to leave behind. The frantic chase. When Javier realized they were trapped, panic overtook him. He shoved Sophia into the passenger seat and revved the engine, slamming the car into reverse. The tires squealed as he fishtailed backward, narrowly missing Marla's patrol car. For a split second, he thought he might break free, but another vehicle appeared at the end of the street, blocking his path. It was Dr. Miles, his own car positioned strategically to prevent escape. "You're not going anywhere," Marla shouted, drawing her weapon. "Turn off the engine and step out of the vehicle." Javier hesitated, his mind racing. He glanced at Sophia, who sat frozen in the passenger seat, trembling uncontrollably. Then, with a snarl of defiance, he slammed the car into drive and floored it, aiming straight for Marla's patrol car. Marla dove out of the way just in time, rolling onto the grass as the sedan roared past. But the chase was far from over. With sirens blaring, Marla jumped back into her cruiser and gave pursuit, radioing for backup. Dr. Miles followed close behind, his hands gripping the wheel tightly as adrenaline coursed through him. For several harrowing minutes, the streets of Pinecrest became a chaotic blur of speeding cars and screeching tires. Javier drove recklessly, swerving through intersections and narrowly avoiding collisions. But Marla, despite her age and guilt-ridden conscience, refused to give up. She matched his speed, cornering him until he ran out of road near the edge of town. Cornered, Javier abandoned the car and bolted on foot, leaving Sofia behind. Marla caught up to him moments later, tackling him to the ground with surprising strength fueled by resolve. Handcuffs clicked into place as she read him his rights, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "It's over, Javier," she said quietly, pulling him to his feet. "You don't get to hurt anyone else." Sofia's rescue. Back at the scene, Dr. Miles found Sofia still sitting in the passenger seat, her body shaking with sobs. He opened the door gently, crouching beside her. "It's okay now," he murmured, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe." Sofia looked at him, her tear-streaked face breaking his heart. For the first time, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes, a fragile light that hadn't been extinguished after all. As paramedics arrived to tend to Sofia, Marla joined Dr. Miles, her expression heavy with regret and relief. "I should have done more for Elena," she admitted softly. "But maybe we can still do something for Sofia." Dr. Miles nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll make sure of it." In the aftermath, the town of Pinecrest began to wake up. From its complacency, its silence, its fear. The arrest of Javier Ortega sent shockwaves through the community, forcing people to confront the ugliness they'd ignored for so long. And for Sofia, a new chapter awaited, one where healing could begin, surrounded by those brave enough to fight for her. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady beep of monitors tracking Sofia's heartbeat. She lay in the bed, her frail body swaddled in blankets, her face pale but peaceful in sleep. The ordeal had left its mark, bruises on her arms, dark circles under her eyes. But she was alive. Fragile, yes, but alive. Dr. Miles stood by the window, watching as dawn painted streaks of gold across the sky. He hadn't slept since the night of Javier's arrest, his mind replaying every moment of the chase, every cry from Sofia, every word Marla Green had spoken about redemption. Now, as he waited for Elena to arrive, he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. Elena's journey. When Dr. Miles had called Elena using the address Maria Alvarez provided, she answered with trembling hesitation. Her voice was barely recognizable, a whisper worn thin by years of fear and regret. But when he told her what had happened, that Sofia was safe and needed her, something inside her seemed to awaken. "I'm coming," she said firmly, her tone laced with determination. "Tell her I'm coming." By sunrise, Elena Morales, or rather, Elena Ortega, was standing outside Sofia's hospital room. She looked older than the woman in Maria's stories, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined with worry. Yet there was still a flicker of the strength Dr. Miles imagined she once possessed, the kind of resilience forged in fire. He approached her gently, offering a reassuring smile. "She's asleep right now, but she'll want to see you." Elena nodded, clutching her purse tightly like a lifeline. Tears welled in her eyes as she took a shaky step toward the door. For years she dreamed of this moment, rehearsed it in her mind over and over again. But now that it was here, she wasn't sure she deserved it. "She won't hate me, will she?" Elena asked softly, her voice breaking. "After everything, after leaving her..." Dr. Miles placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sofia doesn't know the truth yet. All she knows is that you loved her enough to stay away to protect her. That's going to mean more than you realize." Elena swallowed hard, nodding again before stepping into the room. A mother's embrace. Sofia stirred as the door creaked open, her eyelids fluttering awake. At first, she didn't recognize the figure standing hesitantly at the foot of her bed. Then slowly her gaze sharpened, and disbelief washed over her face. "Mom," she whispered hoarsely, her voice cracking with emotion. Elena froze, tears streaming down her cheeks. For a moment, neither of them moved. They simply stared at each other, separated by years of pain and longing. Finally, Elena rushed forward, collapsing onto the edge of the bed and pulling Sophia into a gentle embrace. "I'm so sorry," Elena sobbed, holding her daughter as if afraid she might vanish. "I'm so sorry I left you." Sophia clung to her, her own tears falling freely now. "You're here," she murmured, her voice muffled against Elena's shoulder. "You came back." They stayed like that for what felt like hours, their sobs mingling with the soft hum of the hospital machines. It was a reunion long overdue, a bridge built across years of silence and fear. Truths unveiled later, when Sophia had drifted back to sleep, Dr. Miles joined Elena in the hallway. She sat slumped in a chair, her hands clasped tightly together, her face etched with guilt and grief. "I should have fought harder," Elena said quietly, her voice heavy with self-recrimination. "If I hadn't let him scare me, if I'd stayed, maybe none of this would have happened." Dr. Miles crouched beside her, meeting her gaze with compassion. "You did what you thought was best to survive. No one can blame you for that. What matters now is that you're here, for Sophia, for yourself. You have a chance to make things right." Elena nodded slowly, her resolve hardening. "I'll tell her everything. About Javier, about why I left, about how much I love her. She deserves to know the truth." Dr. Miles smiled faintly. "And we'll help you both through it. You're not alone anymore, Elena." As the morning light filled the hospital corridor, Elena rose to her feet, wiping her tears. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of peace, not because the past could be erased, but because the future held promise. With Sophia by her side and people willing to fight for justice, she knew they could rebuild what had been broken. Pinecrest still carried its scars, but perhaps, just perhaps, healing was finally within reach. The days that followed were fragile, like shards of glass carefully pieced together. Sophia's recovery was slow, her body healing faster than her spirit. Elena stayed by her side constantly, holding her hand, brushing her hair, whispering reassurances whenever fear flickered in Sophia's eyes. But there were moments when silence stretched between them, moments heavy with unspoken truths. One afternoon, as sunlight streamed through the hospital window, Elena finally found the courage to speak. She pulled a chair close to Sophia's bedside and took a deep breath, her voice trembling but steady. "Sophia," she began softly, "there are things you need to know, things I should have told you long ago." Sophia looked at her, curiosity mingling with apprehension. "About Dad?" Elena nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, and about me, about why I left." "A mother's fight. I didn't leave because I didn't love you," Elena continued, her words spilling out in fits and starts. "I left because I was afraid, not just for myself, but for you. When you were little, Javier, he wasn't always the man everyone thought he was. He hurt me, Sophia. Physically, emotionally. He made sure I felt powerless." Sophia's brow furrowed, confusion clouding her expression. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why didn't you stop him?" "I tried," Elena said, her voice breaking. "I filed for a restraining order. I begged the courts to let me take you away from him. But Javier, he had connections, friends in high places. He twisted everything, made it seem like I was the unstable one, like I was the danger." Her hands clenched into fists as she recounted the betrayal. "Even Judge Grayson, the man who dismissed my case, he knew what Javier was doing, knew and did nothing. People in this town, they looked the other way because it was easier than believing the truth." Complicity and silence. Elena paused, swallowing hard. "Javier played them all. He convinced them I was unfit, that I'd abandon you if given the chance. And then, when I dropped the case under pressure, he turned the tables completely, filed his own restraining order against me, claiming I was harassing you both. By the time I realized what he'd done, it was too late. I couldn't fight anymore without risking your safety or mine. Sophia listened in stunned silence, pieces of her fractured childhood beginning to fall into place. The arguments she'd overheard behind closed doors. The times Javier had snapped at her mother, leaving bruises she hadn't understood until now. The sudden absence of Elena from her life, replaced by Javier's suffocating control. "You didn't abandon me," Sophia whispered, her voice barely audible. "You were protecting me." Elena reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Every day I was away, I prayed you'd be okay, that somehow you'd find a way to escape him too. But I never stopped loving you, Sophia. Never." Key figures in the shadows. As Elena spoke, Dr. Miles joined them briefly, bringing copies of the documents he'd uncovered. The original restraining order, the court records, even notes from Maria Alvarez recounting rumors of bribery and coercion involving Judge Grayson and others. Together they painted a damning picture of complicity, a web of lies spun by those who chose comfort over justice. "Judge Grayson died last year," Dr. Miles explained gently. "But we're working with Detective Harris to investigate further, to expose what happened so no one else has to suffer like you two did." Sophia stared at the papers, her hands shaking slightly. It was overwhelming, yet strangely liberating. For years she'd carried guilt and shame, believing she deserved Javier's cruelty. Now she saw the truth. None of it had been her fault. None of it. Rebuilding trust. By evening, the weight of the revelation settled heavily over the room. There was sadness, yes, but also clarity. Sophia leaned back against her pillows, exhaustion etched on her face, but a spark of determination in her eyes. "We'll get through this," she said quietly, looking at Elena. "Together." Elena smiled through her tears, nodding fiercely. "Together." Dr. Miles watched from the doorway, his heart swelling with cautious hope. Healing wouldn't come easily. Not for Sophia, not for Elena, and certainly not for Pinecrest itself. But the cracks in the foundation of lies and fear were starting to show. And where there were cracks, light could seep through. For the first time in years, Sophia slept soundly that night, her mother's arms wrapped protectively around her. Outside, the whispers of Pinecrest stirred once more, but this time they carried the promise of change. The courtroom was packed on the day of Javier Ortega's trial, a rare spectacle for the quiet town of Pinecrest. Neighbors who had once turned a blind eye now sat in uneasy silence, their faces etched with guilt or disbelief as the truth unfolded before them. The air was thick with tension, every whispered conversation hushed under the weight of what was being revealed. Sophia's courage. When Sophia stepped onto the witness stand, her hands trembled, but her voice remained steady. She recounted years of fear, the bruises Javier hid beneath lies, the nights spent listening to his angry tirades, the suffocating control that left her isolated and broken. Her testimony painted a vivid picture of life under Javier's shadow, one far darker than anyone outside their home could have imagined. "He told me no one would believe me if I spoke up," Sophia said softly, her gaze fixed on the jury. "He said I belonged to him, that no one else cared about me. But he was wrong." Elena sat in the front row, gripping Dr. Miles's hand tightly as tears streamed down her face. Watching her daughter confront the man who had tormented them both was agonizing, but also profoundly empowering. Sophia wasn't just speaking for herself. She was giving voice to every victim silenced by fear. As the prosecution presented evidence, photos, medical records, court documents, it became clear that Javier's charm had masked a monster. Witnesses like Maria Alvarez and Deputy Marla Green testified about the systemic failures that allowed his abuse to continue unchecked. The facade of respectability crumbled, exposing the rot within. A guilty verdict. After days of deliberation, the verdict came. Guilty on all counts. Javier Ortega was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. As the judge delivered the sentence, Sophia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It wasn't just justice, It was validation. For the first time, she felt truly free. But the reckoning didn't end there. The trial ignited a broader investigation into Pinecrest's justice system, uncovering decades of complicity and corruption. Judge Grayson's name surfaced repeatedly, along with others who had enabled abusers like Javier to evade accountability. Town meetings were held, reforms proposed, and promises made to ensure such failures wouldn't happen again. Rebuilding trust. In the months that followed, Sofia moved in with Elena, the two of them navigating the fragile process of rebuilding their bond. At first, trust came slowly. Sofia flinched at sudden movements, struggled with nightmares, and wrestled with feelings of inadequacy as she prepared for motherhood. But Elena never wavered, offering patience, love, and unwavering support. Dr. Miles remained a steady presence in their lives, checking in regularly and connecting them with therapists who specialized in trauma recovery. Slowly but surely, Sofia began to heal. She started journaling, pouring her fears and hopes onto paper. She took long walks through Pinecrest woods, finding solace in nature's quiet resilience. And she dreamed of the future, not just for herself, but for the child growing inside her. Hope arrives. One crisp winter morning, weeks before her due date, Sofia went into labor. The delivery was difficult, the baby born prematurely, but healthy. When the nurse placed the tiny bundle in Sofia's arms, tears spilled down her cheeks as she gazed at her daughter's delicate features. "What should we name her?" Elena asked gently, her own eyes shining with emotion. Sofia didn't hesitate. "Hope," she whispered, brushing a finger over the baby's soft cheek. "Her name is Hope." An ending note: life in Pinecrest began to change, though scars remained. Conversations about domestic violence became less taboo, resources expanded, and victims found courage to step forward. Elena became an advocate, sharing her story to educate others and push for reform. Sofia, still young but fiercely determined, started volunteering at a local shelter, helping women find strength they didn't know they had. Together, mother and daughter built a new life, a sanctuary filled with laughter, love, and light. Hope grew into a symbol not just of their family's resilience, but of the town's potential for redemption. And as spring returned to Pinecrest, its people whispered not of secrets and shame, but of hope reborn.